Welcome back to another panel with the Independent Media Alliance. Today joining is myself, Kit, Steve, Havor, Derek, and Catherine to discuss Trump policy in general. But there's a lot to get into around this topic, obviously. I think everybody out there has their own particular part of any upcoming administration and their direction and their policy that interests you more. So today we're going to go through, starting with some of the discussion of some of the policy, or rather, some of the administration picks and some of the directions they might be taking, and then kind of just have a general conversation about how we see the Trump administration, the policies being proposed, how we see that going, and our predictions and our thoughts on where it might be going. I think an important point to make right out of the gate is to recognize that these are all floated right now. These are proposed policies, some of which we can relate to some precedent from Trump's previous administration, things that we know they're more likely to put forward. But by and large, this is going to be a hypothetical conversation about what is likely to happen. And once we get to a point in which we're actually seeing things happen, we'll be able to compare that to what we're discussing today. So welcome everybody today. I believe I was wrong last time. I believe this is the fourth panel for the IMA so far. Lots more to come in general. So I say we start off today with why don't we just throw it to Kit to start, since this was your proposed panel today, and we can just start off with it. Really just start wherever you'd like, but I thought it'd be a good place to start would be around some of the policy picks that you stand out to you on really whatever direction you think is most important as you see it going forward.
I wasn't expecting to go first.
I can jump in if you'd like, if you want to. Go ahead.
Rather than policy, I think a useful discussion would be about, because as you said, policy is still just hypothetical at this point, is about the kind of presidency it's going to be. And I think, for me, what I would expect would be a policy and a presidency which is about regaining credibility in quotes. I think the meta narrative of the world at the moment is an establishment trying to regain credibility, and I think in the specific instance, Trump needs to regain some of his anti-establishment credibility. So I think for the first 6 months to a year of 2025, you'll see Trump do stuff that he probably wouldn't have done last time. A few easy wins thrown out, for pardoning Julian Assange, for example, that would be something he could do. I think that wouldn't be surprised if that happened. I think he will give RFK the free reign to at least talk about stuff he's going to do. I think they've actually played it very cleverly already. I think the rumors that he was distancing himself from RFK post-election, basically 2 days after the election, which they immediately counteract and say, no, we're not. See, and then he names him to be confirmed by the Senate and everything. That's a clever play that wouldn't have been done last time. Trump did dump all his anti-establishment stuff basically immediately last time, and I think this time he won't. I think that's what's the most interesting thing to talk about, how he will play up to anti-establishment stuff this time in order to regain some bona fides.
Really quickly, guys, last time we had a little bit of some audio carryover. If you guys could help me this time, I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. We tried to address it at the beginning, but just try muting your microphones as other people are talking. That'll probably help in general. But I agree with the opening point in general that I think that, again, I think it's clear my opinion of the kind of my pessimistic view of government in general. I would see this through the lens of how they can play the population more so, whichever partisan side we're talking about. However you see it, I would agree that it would seem that there is an interest in trying to really play out the idea of challenging the system, which I think personally, going to the picks, is very hard to make that argument with some of the, straight out of deep state swamp, Zionist, technocrat choices that we're seeing picked just for cabinet positions so far, or rather tapped. Whether they actually become that position or not, I think is interesting. But I do agree, and I think that's it depends on how you see it playing out with what their objective might be. So why don't anybody else jump in, just kind of starting points, policy picks, or rather administrative picks.
We were just saying, Ryan, on AM Wake Up an hour and a half ago that, from day one, it's been pretty obvious that the prerequisite was Israel first, and then loyalty to Donald Trump as either a co-first or a close second. And then the bait and switch with a number of these different appointees who say nice things on camera or say things that, people with a couple of brain cells left to rub together would be like, oh, yeah, well, that does make sense. say that. And then there's also interview after interview where they're pledging their undying loyalty to the Zionist entity, where you've got Pam Biondi talking about, rounding up and deporting anti-Semites, where you've got just example after example of massive government overreach and complete trampling of every existing right that we have remaining. And yet people who ought know better, who have previously pointed out the similar flaws in a lot of the same people and certainly the same type of person, are cheerleading because, it makes the liberals cry or whatever.
I just did a quick short list, just my quick thoughts, where the different factions I think that are going to be strong in this second administration. Israel, of course, the Times of Israel itself just published an article saying who are the Jews in Trump's inner circle and how will they affect his second term. And then, of course, I think the defense military industrial complex is going to have a strong presence. Pharma, Mehmet Oz and others. And for me, the big one is technocracy or big tech. I think that's the key. And I had a chat yesterday with Patrick Wood of Technocracy, and he's going to give a presentation this weekend, he said, but he's talking about techno-populism. And I think that's sort of the cutting edge of all of this. And again, the definition of techno-populism says it's either a populism in favor of technocracy or a populism concerning certain technology, usually information technology or any populist ideology conversed using digital media. It can be employed by single politicians or whole political movements, respectively. And it says neighboring terms used are technocratic populism, technological populism, and cyber populism. And to me, that sounds a lot like the Trump administration with Elon Musk, where they've merged populism with technocracy. And that just seems to be, I think, what they're going to be doing.
I'd like to jump in here real quick if I could. I'm gonna have to jump off in a few minutes, but basically to pick up there on the techno-populism angle, I think that is really important. And besides maybe some potentials like Kit was talking about for Trump to, do some anti-establishment things to try to get his street cred back, I think we can already clearly see what Steve was talking about, the numerous people who are associated with Israel, who have, outright supported Israel and Zionism. Trump's already saying he's going to lift any limits on arms deals to Israel. He's already saying, as soon as he gets into office, they're going to start limiting free speech on campuses to go after anti-Semitic propaganda. So I think we're going to see the increase in that. And in terms of the technocracy aspect, Jim O'Neill, who is appointed or at least nominated to HHS Deputy Secretary, who would serve under RFK if they're both chosen. He is a former CEO of Peter Thiel's, the Thiel Foundation. So, I mean, that to me is everybody here and hopefully in the audience is aware of Peter Thiel and understands the importance of that. I'm also working on another investigation for TLAV right now, looking deeper into Elon Musk and specifically his role, why he's so much embracing Donald Trump. And I think there's some really clear, obvious examples. That would be, for one, he stands to benefit immensely financially from all the different military industrial complex contracts that his companies have. And I'm specifically looking at his Star Shield program, which started to be reported on late in 2023. And it has, bits of information have been dripping out this year. But what we've come to realize is that it's a $1.8 billion classified contract. And more details are pointing to that the contract's probably with the National Reconnaissance Office, which handles all the satellites and the surveillance around the planet. And using Starlink and in this Star Shield program, Musk, especially now with Trump in office, it can expect to get more financial business, but also to help the military industrial complex, the U.S. military, the U.S. intelligence apparatus, to have the ability, in their own words, to see anyone anywhere on the planet to a degree that they've never had before, where they're basically saying the head of the NRO in a recent discussion about this said there will be nowhere for anybody to hide. Of course, they're saying this is just for bad guys, for terrorists. But I think that's another aspect of creating this technocrat dream of being able to monitor everything on the planet and in order to allocate resources, of course, terrorism, catch bad guys, all that sort of stuff. That to me is another big picture that a lot of the Trump supporters aren't seeing. And I'll just throw this one in real briefly since I can't be on too long today. But Trump also just this week announced Chad Cronister, who's currently a sheriff in Florida. He's supposed to head the DEA. Just one interesting connection here that our fellow IMA member Whitney Webb has written about in her book. The sheriff Chad Cronister, his wife is Nikki, what is the name? DeBartolo, and her father, Edward DeBartolo Sr. He was known for his mafia connections going back to Ohio, where he was in business with Les Wexner, who of course was one of the financiers behind Jeffrey Epstein, and Les Wexner was part of the mega group, which is, of course goes back to Israel and Mossad connections there. So this sheriff out of Florida, who's being appointed at the head of DEA, his wife and her family have connections to the mafia, and her brother actually used to own the San Francisco 49ers, and he was fined like $1 million and given a felony conviction for some shady business deals he did. Trump actually pardoned him during his first term. So again, you can see that sort of coming full circle. Trump pardons a friend, and then that friend's brother-in-law is appointed to be DEA head of the DEA. So, I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of just swampy different connections going on that hopefully more and more people will be paying attention to.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that it's obvious that this is going away from what was generally promised. I think that's what I'm so interested by, to see the reactions before we even get into policy of the people that are being tapped. They're so transparently, I mean, outside of the kind of like Q narrative of the insiders to fight from the inside, which there's some level of logic to, but it just does seem to be pretty outstandingly, a deviation. So anybody have any opening thoughts about policy or picks so far before we kind of just jump into the actual different policy categories?
So I have been watching the battle over the Secretary of Treasury. One of the biggest issues faced by the U.S. government right now is how they're going to modify the global dollar system. So you see an effort all around the world. The dollar was weaponized with sanctions starting in 2014. And that process is really, killing the goose that laid the golden egg, because more and more people are now trying to move away from the dollar. And the question is, how are you going to track them back into the dollar or force them back into the dollar? And if you don't, how are you going to re-engineer the military and cost of capital economics, including, sitting down much harder on the domestic populations within the G7? So there's fundamental economics in the system that are changing, and you have to evolve with it or find a way to significantly defend the system. And so you see, as Trump is deciding these different financial and sort of the financial side of his picks, you're seeing the debate of what you do and how you do it. And there was a real tense debate over whether Scott Bessent was going to be chosen as Secretary of Treasury, who finally was, versus Howard Lutnick. So Howard Lutnick was the co-chair of the transition team, and he is the head of Cantor Fitzgerald, which is one of the largest primary dealers. So if you look at all of the funny business at the federal government, from the bailouts to 21 trillion missing to FASB 56, Howard Lutnick is one of the key people moving the money out of American retirement funds and into the Treasury, and then it disappears out the back door. So you're basically, this guy is the guy who's had an unbelievably successful career and become a billionaire, financing one of the greatest bank robberies in the history of the world. Okay. And which is why it's so interesting when they talk about re-engineering government and the Doge initiative. They don't talk about, well, let's look at, keeping secret books. Let's look at getting the government back into legal compliance with the financial management laws. Let's look at where the $21 trillion went. Let's look at where the $23 trillion on the ballot. They're not talking about any of that. And in fact, Lutkin, in his speech and different interviews at Bitcoin 2024 and different interviews, was very, how can I describe it, was very encouraging of privatizing the land and minerals at the federal government. He basically said, we don't need to worry about $36 trillion of debt because we have $500 trillion of land and minerals that can be monetized. So it's sort of the plunder team versus, if you look at Basant's record, he's much more of an equity investor and an equity builder. And if you listen to his recent statements, he talks about how the U.S. is attracting capital from all around the world, which right now is true. So it was really, in the financial world, it was really sort of the plunder and private equity guys versus the equity investors, and the equity investors won, even though you would think Basant was not sort of a Trump pick. Lutkin has been a very close and loyal guy. And I continue to believe that the Republican establishment really, really supported Trump. They've decided he's the guy who can get the control grid for them, whereas, Biden and Harris were not people who could get the control grid done. And if anything, this signals the sort of mainstream Republican establishment raising their fist and saying no to Lutnick and the plunder team, which I think is very interesting.
We do have the point of Commerce Secretary overlap, and so why don't we start with the conversation of finances in general? Since you start there in general, Catherine, talk about Donald Trump's statements around the dollar, because I do find this to be, again, the general point of like very contradictory to any of the floated directions. Trump recently said this on the 30th. The idea that BRICS countries are trying to move away from the dollar while we stand by and watch is over. We require a commitment from these countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty US dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs and should expect to say goodbye to selling into the wonderful US economy. They can go find another sucker. There is no chance that the BRICS will replace the US dollar in international trade, and any country that tries should wave goodbye to America. I've got plenty of thoughts. Who wants to start on that?
I would just say that I think that this, for one, Catherine mentioned about a lot of good things there with Howard Lutnick, and Ryan, you and I were there at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville watching Howard Lutnick give his big speech. And for those who also don't know, Howard Lutnick was also one of the next door neighbors of Jeffrey Epstein and former Hillary Clinton donor. So there's a lot of weird things about him. He also coincidentally did not show up for work on 9/11, and the Twin Towers collapsed with his building, his company inside of it. Yeah, that's the article I wrote there about the co-opting of Bitcoin, which I know was covered on the previous panel. But I think as far as the BRICS things go, my main thought in that is specifically that I think this is going to play up, and I know some folks here have done work on this, going to play up this angle of the BRICS versus the U.S. hegemony, the multipolar order versus the old world order, and just dynamics around that. So whether that means people who, because a lot of people are starting to look at Russia and China as the opposition to the NATO world order, and this is going to kind of play into the storyline that maybe Trump is taking that back and he's taking a stand against whatever the BRICS are up to. Personally, my view is that neither of them are for liberty and are going to be good for people in the long term. And that's just another false binary that people are falling into, which is, I know, a big part of what we've been trying to push back against here. So yeah, I don't have any specific thoughts beyond that I just think that this discussion and Trump's comments against the BRICS are just going to play further into that binary.
Well, what it does is it sets up the imminent, immediate accelerated collapse of the dollar, especially if he plans on implementing tariffs on top of the income tax. Yeah, that's a recipe for absolute disaster, with an immediate solution being, well, here's a series of tokens that we're going to go ahead and move our financial system onto, and we have our strategic Bitcoin reserve that we paid down X percentage of the debt or have deals with debtor nations. And Catherine can probably speak better to how that's an absolute strangulation of both what's already garbage fiat currency, but the international dollar, along with the ease of implementation of what's ultimately going to be on the back end a CBDC.
So here's the challenge if you're running the dollar system, and that is The Bretton Woods system was we pay and fund the global military protection of the and you can sell into the U.S. market, which at the time was the largest consumer market. Now it's the EU was larger, but so we fund all the expenses of running that open platform, and you get to play on it as long as you use the dollar. And so you got a tithe from the dollar, and that tithe helped pay for all the expenses of running the platform. You still got the expenses of running the platform, but the tithe is being eroded. So how do you evolve the model? And that's the big question. And do you have to shut down the platform? I agree totally with Derek. If you look at the latest pronouncements from the BRICS, both at the BRICS meeting, but then at the G20 meeting in New Delhi, they're fully on board for the global BIS, digital ID, CBDC, biometrics control. So it's almost two different flavors. I think they're arguing about who's going to be the middle management for the control model. So neither of those guys are a savior. But if you look at the fundamental economics of the dollar system, it's got to be evolved. And the question is, how do you do that?
Just to add on BRICS, my feeling is that it's kind of weak sauce. A lot of what we hear about BRICS, I was listening to Lavrov this week, and he's like, yeah, the whole BRICS payment system, it was Lula's idea in Brazil like a year or two ago. And you hear all this talk, but nothing is really coming of it. It's almost like BRICS has been concocted as this punching bag for the Western hegemonic model.
Well, but here is what's coming in. They are working on a payment system, but what's real, and it's been going on since the East Asian financial crisis, is they're trying to do as much trade as possible in their own currencies direct. And if you look at the efforts China has made to move currency hubs and trading platforms around the world, and then to Moscow, the Moscow Central Bank put an office in Beijing, and they're using gold to make settlements. That's all very incremental, but very slowly and steadily, it's chipping away at the dollar reserve, at both the trade market share and the reserve market share. That's real. There is an erosion of the market share, and that erosion is going to be accelerated because the way the sanctions have been used is very short-term and short-sighted. The dollar is giving up a lot of market power, by scaring people. And I think one of the things that really scares them is not just what they've seen from the sanctions so far, but when you combine that with what they're seeing in Gaza and in Israel, I think that combination is it makes a country and their financial officers take a deep breath and go to the long, slow, hard work of building alternatives, which takes decades, but they're working on it. And that's real.
And just to add on both of your points of the dollar collapse, I'm a fan of Andy Schekman's thesis of Miles Franklin, where he says that it's almost like they're intentionally accelerating this collapse and pushing BRICS because, it's too obvious. You've had Mackinder and that thesis for a century saying, don't drive Eurasia together, and everything that we're doing is precisely driving everyone. You can't be that stupid. And so I think that the point is to accelerate the transition to whatever new system.
But remember, the dollar system is still unbelievably dominant and strong. And the assets that it controls are still, right now, the United States is in a huge bubble with capital from all around the world coming in. And the U.S. market, Financial Times just published a big piece that's correct about how the worst bubble on the planet is the U.S. equity markets, because both with respect to the dollar and the U.S. equity market, there's no other game in town. And so, it's what the economists used to call dangerous and dominant. It's still very dominant and very, very rich.
Well, so what's interesting to me is that it seems that we are generally arguing that no matter what people are thinking, that the direction seems to be this kind of controlled demolition for the next phase, the CBDC. What I find interesting is that, from Trump's perspective, and this is something I can't stop seeing across all these different actions, from the smallest part to the largest dynamic, that they're using the problems that we know are there that they've created to roll you into the next problem. And so Trump coming at this from the BRICS side of it, right? Like, that we're going to go after that, which, by the way, doesn't seem to jive with what we're being told, right? This seems to be solidifying the control of this structure, even going with Bitcoin. and using it against the way it's actually challenged the dollar. It shouldn't be for using it to bolster it. So the question is, and this is so well played if you think about it, or rather the point is that if he's going after it that way, and we're arguing, well, that's going to actually accelerate the demise of the dollar. And that's, some of his insiders are going to go, yes, you see, wink, wink. That's the point. Trump's 4D chess move is to destroy the dollar. But that, I don't think that's the case. I think he's genuinely a part of the establishment. So it's the point is that it's so interesting how you can walk that line and make it, take these actions that are, I guess, in line with what he wants his base that thinks he's fighting as the outsider to think he would do, but essentially in a direction that brings in the CBDC. So it's like, how do you fight past that? It's just a broad question that we don't have to answer. It's like, it's just so interesting how they play it, but go ahead.
So let me ask you guys a question that I've been trying to figure out. So we have Elon Musk. The Financial Times just wrote a great piece about the fact that Tesla is the most subsidized electronic vehicle company in China. Okay. So this is a guy who's getting massive subsidy from the Chinese government. As was just pointed out, he's getting massive contracts and subsidy from the U.S. government. So he's basically a government contractor, right? Massive, massive subsidy. This is not a private entrepreneurial effort. And he has a company who is working on putting a mesh network or putting a network in the back of your head and hooking you up to his satellites, which is, clearly being billed as one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful surveillance tool in the world. So I can't imagine anybody whose record is more deep state than that. And, and imagine if the CBDCs can get hooked up and the social credit system can get hooked up to the back of your brain and run through satellites that you can't shut off or protect yourself from. So why am I constantly being told in many, many circles that I can't criticize Elon Musk because he's one of us and he's fighting for freedom? How is this achieved?
In a couple of different ways. One, because we live in the most propagandized country on the face of God's green earth ever in the history of always. And number two, because the most craven, opportunistic, well-heeled thought leaders have been telling absolutely everyone for years now that Elon Musk is the smartest guy in every room that he walks in, and flowers literally spring up from, where he's trod. And people buy into that. If you can convince people for years that everyone who talked about Harvey Weinstein was crazy, or everyone who spoke up about Hollywood was crazy, they said Dave Chappelle was on crack and all that kind of stuff. If you can, convince people that it's okay to invade countries based on nothing except for, hey, I kind of think we should invade this country, then you can definitely convince them that Elon Musk saved free speech by not allowing any of you to see who the people on XCore are that actually own Elon Musk and the platform, with only disclosing a handful of the banks that he drew loans from in order to get that $44 million. So, I mean, I've said this before, but I've never seen the inversion of reality on display the way that I have over the last, 18 months.
I think some important points to highlight, I don't think it's the majority, my personal opinion, that is falling for most of this. And I think that's part of why it's so aggressive, but it's definitely a large portion of the population. But I think it comes down to the savior complex, right? There are people, and I'm specifically talking about that smaller, let's just say 49, 51, the 49% that's falling for it. I think it's that we have been so conditioned to need somebody in power to slip in and save us from this. And so that's the obvious, always been their point, but it's ramped up like crazy. Then I think we add the reality that, like we're talking about in general, where they're floating almost the problem as the solution, but as long as the good guy's pointing to it, then it's the right choice. The good guy AI, the good guy brain chip. And I think that's as simple as it gets. And I to your point, Catherine, I'm actually of the mind that it's rapidly shrinking. And I think that's why there's so much kind of flailing desperation when we can see through all of this stuff, because it's just not working anymore. So there's a positive spin to that, you know? And I think that with Elon and the rest of them, I mean, it's just so transparently the opposite. You know, you're saving free speech while you're literally censoring people. I don't think that's working, but I think it's about people that need to believe in that. You know, so to bring it back to the dollar in general, you know, to this tweet, you know, I think what's interesting is on top of just the idea of doing you know, what is kind of bolstering the establishment position from an outside perspective, if you will, if that's how they want to see it, neither that they won't be able to create it. Like, so in what world are you saying you're going to stop them from doing what they would want to do, even if it does counter your objective, or not back any others? I mean, it's, you know, 100% tariffs, which by the way is a tax on you, America, you know, and what's interesting about the whole thing is that it is an authoritarian position. There's no question about that. And so it comes to this idea where you're through this illusion, flimsy as it is, of an outsider to get in the minds of Americans that we're supposed to be like this. This is the might makes right perspective, and it's exactly the opposite.
But here's the thing: it's an operationally it is operationally not possible to put 100% tariffs on.
Right.
In other words, if you look at the speed it would take us to replace and make the stuff we use. I mean, you know, somebody the other day, as a defense contractor, said it brilliantly, said, the only way we can have a war with China is if China keeps making our weapons. So it's not, you know, what he's saying is not operationally feasible, and everybody knows that.
Yeah, and add this, by the way, to the point. This was just recently, at least Disclosed TV reported this. China bans exports of gallium, germanium. I'm not sure. This is what antimony. You don't know how to pronounce that one. What is it?
Antimony.
Antimony. Thank you. And these are just, you know, rare earth mineral, important. You know, so it's. I think to your point, Catherine. I think this. If you like, James Corbett has written over the years about the engineered fall of the West. That very much feels like where this is going.
Yeah,
you know?
that's the. If I can just jump in there, that's what I mean. I think that slams together the two things we were just talking about there. I think for the long, you say, what do we expect from Trump's presidency? I think Trump is the managed deterioration of America. I think Trump is a transfer team for the shift from America being the global hub of power to somewhere else. I'm not sure exactly what that will be, but I think that's what we can expect. And I think, going back to the Elon Musk question, that's a very interesting question. Elon Musk does want Neuralink. He does want a carbon tax. He said that before. He does want digital currencies. He's right there at the forefront of all of that, and is currently anti-establishment, because the grander propaganda thing here is to define what the establishment is, define it for us, then kill it in front of our eyes and claim the establishment is gone. And what's in the establishment? Well, that's not technocratic stuff. That doesn't count. That's all rebellion stuff. Digital money, Elon Musk likes that. That's rebellion stuff. That's anti-establishment stuff. What's the establishment is the dollar. What's the establishment is the FBI. What's the establishment is the wrong kind of politicians in the Senate. So we'll stuff the Senate with a bunch of loudmouth idiots who sound like they're rebels when they don't even understand anything. We put an idiot in the White House who just blathers on about nonsense. And we'll claim that we've somehow overhauled the establishment, whilst at the same time pushing nothing but establishment agendas the whole time.
And
yeah.
I just want to add real quick to that, where I feel this second time around, it's even more unnerving because it's more insidious, as Kit just explained. And, you know, here's just one more example. Jay, whose last name I can never pronounce, Jay Bhattacharya, who's going to be the head of the NIH, apparently.
If he's approved.
He did a lot of good work with COVID, but I just saw a clip of Peter Thiel speaking how he referred to Jay as his friend. And then you start seeing all these connections. And I'm like, wait, Jay is friends with Peter Thiel? And then Thiel maybe he's wittingly, or he might wittingly or unwittingly carry out ideas that Thiel has suggested to him because he trusts Thiel. And so, just other things we haven't brought up either. Sebastian Gorka, right? Who's this crazy war hawk tied up with British intelligence. And so, yeah, you see all these, if you pull back the weeds, you see all these sort of maggots underneath.
Well, and what's interesting about it all is that, these are, I mean, Bhattacharya, for example, of all of the picks I would say like the same like a Gabbard point is it's better, I guess, than some of the other ones we're talking about. But I agree that if you look deep, if you look into it, he was promoting the shots at some points, saying, yes, get this, it's good for some, get the booster. And so, again, to your point, and this is always the fair, objective way to frame it. Maybe he's just wrong, but it still doesn't change the fact that he's wrong in a very important way, and that's being, chosen for this. But I agree with you. I think it stands to reason with the teal overlap and these different things that these are people that are more apt to lean in that direction if they're, whether they believe it's right or wrong or not. And I think it's an alarming aspect of it. The Gorka example, these are people that they demonstrate exactly the same problems as everybody else they claim they're pushing back against, but because it's under a flavor of MAGA or at least feigning to the right, it just gets ignored, And so in general, I'm all about the administrative picks, at least what they're putting forward before they get confirmed or not, I think are very, very important to talk about. But generally today we were going to get more into the policy, but I think the idea of the picks themselves tend to overlap. So feel free to jump back and forth, guys, between
So
any
let me bring up one policy. So I've been watching Doge very carefully, and obviously it's just an invention in everybody's mind right now, but it has been announced that the first audit that Doge is going to do is of the IRS. And I want to point out two things because I have a very suspicious mind. Last year, Janet Yellen said that the American people owe $7 trillion in back taxes, uncollected taxes. And if you were going to audit the 21 trillion that's missing, you would audit the Treasury, the DOD, HUD, and the New York Fed. You wouldn't audit the IRS. You can't find anything there. If you were going to audit all sorts of other serious financial crimes and sort of the breaking of the financial management laws, it wouldn't be the IRS. What you would do if you were doing the IRS is you would be trying to collect the $7 trillion. And if you look at what Palantir does and the power of its software is perfect to track down and try and collect that $7 trillion from everyday Americans. So the one thing I would say is that it looks to me, if you look at Doge, that you're looking at something that's much more designed potentially to plunder than to really fix things.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that, and I think the point again is to whether this even becomes something, whether they're even nominated in the first place. But I think that what it's being outlined as, and I think we actually expressed this in the last panel as well. It's just sort of like this very obvious trapdoor or whatever you'd call it, a trap in regard to the artificial intelligence example. Where it's right on the surface of it. They're openly already leaning in, pointing to using AI to better make things more efficient, where in some cases you could obviously point out that probably would have some level of effect in a positive way. It's good.
Here's the thing to understand. If you're going to use AI to do that, it means you're going to bring in corporate contractors who use AI to do that. You're not going to give AI tools to the civil service. And in fact, it looks to me like they're trying to destroy the civil service so you can have a complete corporate takeover of the government. I mean, if you want to get to taxation without representation, what do? You do digital ID, CBDC, and you kill the civil service.
Yep. And on top of that, the large portion of the AI elements are going to be these Israeli startup companies. And I was just covering this recently on the show, and that's very alarming. But even just the spyware itself, which is intertwined with all these, Derek was just covering this. It's about almost 50% of the market of spyware alone is Israeli startup companies. And it doesn't have to inherently mean that these are malicious, but if you understand the overlap there to their intelligence elements, it's a very alarming point. So now we're talking about rolling out AI, and this is just one element of what they're using these for efficiency. And that's going to end up being internally interwoven with just about everything financial this country does and a lot more. I don't know why that's not a huge red flag. For those out there from the right side that don't see the threat for Israel, make it China, right? In your mind, whatever it is, a foreign entity that has that kind of access is very concerning to me.
So I just want to point out, Matt Gaetz, who went down quickly as the nominee for Attorney General, has never received any contributions from AIPAC or pretty much any. If you go look at his current page on Open Secrets, he's only got $9,000 he's ever taken in from PACs. Most of his money is from individuals. So he's no AIPAC. Massey Many people hoped Massey would get the Department Secretary of Agriculture nod. He also refuses to take money from APAC, and APAC spent 400,000 plus trying to get rid of him, and it didn't, it didn't even bump his numbers at all. So it didn't work, but he clearly didn't get Secretary of Ag. So, it does seem that Israel is sort of a gatekeeper on the nominees.
And as we mentioned already, Pam Bondi, to replace Gates, again, still just the nominee, is openly, aggressively pro-Israel. And the point to make in all these is not just that they're pro-Israel, but pro-Israel at the expense of American rights. And this is very clear based on the way they discuss this in the context of free speech and a lot of other things.
Well, and Biondi has an Epstein overlap too that shouldn't be ignored in terms of examining how she might behave in that AG position.
Absolutely. Well, so on that point, then let's get into some other specific policies. So, do any other thoughts?
If I could just
Good.
finish on the picks, like a lot of it is going to be a more fluid situation than, like, a lot of it will be putting names out there and seeing how the public react.
Right.
And like people said at first, when it was rumored that he would be distancing himself from Kennedy, people complained that didn't happen in the end. Kennedy is now put forward for whatever it is, health secretary or something. But this is itself sort of a reality TV like episode where Trump can basically name whoever he wants in order to get his good boy points, because they all have to be confirmed by the Senate anyway. So even if he can pick people he knows he has no chance of ever getting the job, and I think there are several on his list already that won't be approved. I mean, I can't think of the FBI guy he just named.
Kash Patel.
Kash Patel.
Thank you. Yeah. Maybe Kennedy himself. There are several and that way, when nothing changes, people will say, well, Trump was handicapped by the Senate, who wouldn't pick his guys.
Right.
And then he'll be
wholeheartedly
tricked
agree.
by the deep state again. Sorry, Ron.
Right.
Again,
No,
yeah.
I say the same thing. I wholeheartedly agree. And I think this is a very easy part of this to see. Like, I make the same point with RFK Jr., for example. And again, my perspective comes from the left-right paradigm as a ploy from a government entity trying to rationalize the choices they want, right? That's how I see it. Either way, it's the same point, that the RFK point is that he gets floated, and knowing the Senate or just the government doesn't want him in that position. So then Trump can stand back and act like he tried. The Democrats wouldn't let him. And, it ends up being the same dynamic, or more so from a two-party part of it, that Trump is putting forward people that he knows they'll push back on. So the other person who's just a little bit less bad ends up being the one, but that's the one he wanted all along. I mean, these are easy things to wrap your mind around. It's the lesser of evils dynamic on a Senate confirmation situation here. And I think that that's problematic, because all of these people, like, can you imagine all the different people that could be put forward out there that maybe aren't politicians, that are just, educated in certain policy? I mean, to pretend, just like with the presidential dynamic, that this is the best that they have to offer. Okay, these are insider swamp creatures, So I agree with your point. I mean, what do you guys think in general? Quick question. Do you think conservatives are seeing through this in a large way, or do you think this is more just my wishful thinking opinion?
I see a good portion that are buying into it. I'm more cynical, being from the Balkans myself.
Yeah.
but just to go back to when you mentioned policy and the techno-populist angle, I was looking at one of the on PolitiFact, right, mainstream news, where it says Trump wants to end a mobile phone application that migrants use to access Customs and Border Protection services, even though his administration launched the tool in 2020. Again, it's like the whole Operation Warp Speed thing. And I think his hand will be forced where, by hook or by crook, because of migration, they want to deport people. How are they going to classify, sift through who's been deported, who's not? Digital IDs. There's clips of Trump years back talking about using these technologies to, close off the border and all this stuff. And the EU next year is onboarding the EES entry exit system and ETIAS. So now when you go to non-Europeans going to Europe, you're going to have to first apply through a social credit system before you go. And then when you get there, they're going to take your eye scans and the fingerprints. And I think they're going to do the same in the US and every country, matter of fact. So they're going to be building these entry-exit systems in every country around the world. And so I think that's going to be part of the techno-populist plan. And I think we'll also see North American integration somehow. They'll be pushing that. And And then you've got the war aspect as well. I think Trump is the guy for pushing war with Iran and perhaps pivoting to China.
Trump
And to kind of,
joining Canada with the United States, I think the last couple of days, if you saw that.
Yeah.
So there you go. Go ahead,
yeah,
Steve.
no, to kind of put a cap on, how the right has reacted to these picks. Some of you guys know that, like 25 years ago or whatever, I used to do Renaissance festivals all over the country. And there was a particular event that would happen called Mimosa Monday, where after a particularly grueling week that involved trying to entertain middle school and high school kids for 3 days during the week when you're supposed to be preparing for your weekend work, you then had to go into your weekend work, which was also a 3-day weekend. And then so you had Mimosa Monday. And so at Mimosa Monday, every time somebody would show up, everyone who was already there would go, yay! And then when they would leave, everyone would go, boo! And it went on for the better part of the day. And that's where the population is right now in terms of team sports mentality with how all of these picks are going. They'll throw a Kash Patel or a Tulsi Gabbard or an RFK at everybody, go, yay! And then, they'll bring up dude for DEA or all of the Bolton and Mike Pompeo acolytes. And then they'll go, boo! And then they'll just go on with their day. Because that's all the energy that a lot of people have to give to this. And if you can capture a news cycle where it looks like the other team is angry, then you feel good. And if it looks like the other team is like, oh, well, that seems to be a reasonable blah blah blah, you're like, oh, what the heck is this deep state no good Nick doing in my administration? Yeah, it's like getting a trade for a player that you don't like from another team. And that's the mentality that it's being approached. It's certainly the level of discourse that I see about it, especially from a lot of the mainstream alternative media.
Yeah, I saw a recent study that was going around. I don't know if it's recent. I saw a discussion of a study that was going around that it might not be recent, but the point being that in the general recent time frame of politics, like last decade, it seems that we generally focus more, which we all see, we are led more by the ideas of what they're putting forward than what they actually do, which we all know. But this is just being like statistically mapped out, how people tend to just fall into what they go, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And we all know that they're just saying what we want to hear, but yet people seem to be swayed by that more than ever. So I agree. I think it's very obvious that this is, that if the best they can do is, be happy the other side's irritated. Well, I think that's very much engineered. So let's start with a very large example of all this that Hivork was just pointing to in regard to immigration, right? The idea of the mass deportation, like this is one of the biggest policy points that I think, that I think it'd be really hard for him to pull back on this. Some of the rest of the things they float when they're running, they tend to float a lot of things that don't come to pass. That one I think would be a very hard one to pull back on. The largest mass deportation effort in American history. So I think there's a lot of things that stand out in this immigration point in general, like some of the things that like Forbes is writing, for example, to prohibit undocumented immigrants from receiving any benefits and birthright citizenship for citizens of undocumented immigrants, reinstitute a travel ban, for example, from other countries. The one that stood out to me was mandate extreme vetting of foreign nationals, block federal grants to sanctuary cities, and ultimately like these policies that lead to more invasive spying on Americans, right? So some of these things you could point out are legally make sense, but the worry is whether these are just a segue into more surveillance of Americans, whether on the border or not. So let's talk about immigration. Start wherever you want. Anybody want to jump in?
I would say we're at the point where we're not really talking policies anymore. Policy isn't the word. What we're looking for is excuses. And the American excuse for digital ID is illegal immigrants. They'd round people up, put them in camps, take their biometrics, whatever, because we hate you mentioned the European ESS coming in. That's meant to be about efficiency. That's about efficiency and saving time and saving money, but it's the same exact thing. In Britain as well, it's going to be about stopping immigrants. In other countries, it will be about securing the border because of pandemics and so on and so on. These are excuses to do what they always want to do. They're not policies. Maybe they'll mass deport people. Maybe they won't. They'll certainly spend a lot of money building camps to store illegal immigrants in, and government contractors will make a fortune doing it. But whether or not they actually deport anybody, they don't care. They can just say they did, for one thing. They can stick a headline on the New York Times that says they've deported 200,000 people since June, and no one's going to be able to say they didn't.
That's a good point. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in the idea of the mass deportation, it would be difficult, I argue, to not do something, right? So but I think it's an interesting point that this could just be, well, I mean, what do the rest of you think about the actual legitimacy of the entire program? Do you think that there will be a mass deportation, or to Kit's point, do you think that's just the entirely floated guys? I guess what I'm saying is I think there are very clearly people within the Republican side that do have a very clear agenda within that, from a specific, like not just the means to an end, but really do have an interest in this for other local reasons or other political reasons. So what do you guys think? Is that something that will happen, or is it just a complete feigned, is it feigned?
So here's the thing. If you say this from the White House, then the sheriffs are going to get active doing it. And you can't stop them from doing it because they would be deporting people who are here illegally. I will say I agree entirely with Kit that these are not policies, they're excuses. And if immigration doesn't work, they're planning on using election fraud. So Trump has made a really big deal about using digital IDs for election fraud. But if you look at many of these policies as excuses, including war, the goal is to control the domestic population. Not to fight with the Russian population, but to control you need an excuse to control the domestic population. I don't know if anybody saw the interview with Joe Rogan and Mark Andreessen, which was very much designed to make Silicon Valley look like your friend. But one of the things I was floored. I was on the floor. Joe Rogan said, yes, we absolutely need AI to govern because it's all too complicated for humans to govern. And you said, I can't believe I'm hearing this. So no wonder he gets paid so much money.
Yeah, I like the phrase algocracy. Back in March of 2020, I was in Spiro Skouras's now defunct program, and I mentioned that COVID was all about bringing in global algocracy, or rule by algorithm. And now you have Rogan and big tech guys saying, let's bring in algocracy, rule by AI. And just today, I think, Off Guardian has done a great job with this, where Denny Rancourt in Canada, where his thesis was that COVID was sort of a, what did he say, like a simulation for war, where you had rationing, end of free speech, almost martial law. Today in South Korea, the president declared martial law, and the article actually said he didn't really specify anything. He's like North Korea. So
communists.
He's like, and he actually said for freedom and to protect the Constitution. So sort of like war is peace. Freedom is dictatorship. So martial law, and it's the same. They just use these different pretexts of pandemic, climate, war to carry out the same measures of rationing.
Well, they call it all war in the end. It wasn't a pandemic; it was the war on COVID, and it's not climate change. It's the war on climate change, the war on drugs, the war on terrorism. It's always about putting people on a war footing. Right.
I mean, and the central point here, and that's a great thing to bring up here in regard to how the rationalization, whatever it is, I think as Steve was covering this morning, I think they're even referencing like stopping fake news. Like this is all about fighting the information war, and literally using real world kinetic, like martial law. And so the point is, this is what we see, hopefully as an American perspective, that this is what's coming, right? This is what is literally the rationale to get us in that position. Even if you think that position will help fight the problem. It's like everything else. The Patriot Act, these things never go away, right? And the point I was making this morning on AM Wake Up is even if you think this is the right move, and even if they have the best of intentions, what happens if 3 weeks in, Trump has a heart attack and then advance or whatever, and somebody takes power who does want to use it that way? I think that is Trump. But either way, the point is anybody could use this to effectively remove your rights, And
well,
go ahead.
A post 9/11 America has been about building the dictator's toolkit for the incoming administration, regardless of what party affiliation may be in power at any given moment. And that's been going on unceasingly. And it's amazing how people haven't necessarily put two and two together on that and made the connection that, holy crap, it really could be literally anyone, even a cartoon character like Donald Trump. And that's how governance is done. In terms of continuity of government, there's a number of different ways that you can apply it, and powers of the executive are one of the aspects that are least discussed in terms of how this operation is conducted.
Yeah, the executive order dynamic is it's obscene, and it's this complete circumvention. And I argue that's how a lot of this stuff is actually going to come to pass, as we were talking about this morning, right? Well, Fox News we were referencing that joke this morning, where it literally opens their show the other day by saying, "Man, I can't wait for Trump to just executive order his way through this." It's like, how depressing is a statement like that? You know, when they control every aspect of the current situation, it's crazy. But so let's talk about some of the more specifics, like under the crime dynamic. Vowing to invest in hiring and retaining police officers, and specifically, as Derek was talking about earlier, to increase their protections from legal liability, and then rolling out the stop and frisk dynamic under a guise of getting illegal immigrants, deploying federal troops, including the National Guard. So let's be clear. You mentioned this about foreign troops coming home. So we're in posse comitatus level here to restore law and order when local officers refuse to act, which is important because that's usually where you start to see the breakdown. Right, where the enforcement arm starts going, you know what, we're not going to enforce your broken laws. Well, now he's trying to set an authoritarian level to go, well, we'll just come right over the top of that, or death penalty for drug dealers and drug cartels. I mean, that's the Philippines dynamic, right? I mean, these are all very alarming, even if you're going after bad guys in your mind. So anybody want to talk about any of those specifics of the crime aspect?
The protection from liability is interesting. It reminds me of a long time ago, one of a good documentary, underrated documentary I saw called Hot Coffee. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
It's wonderful, wonderful documentary.
It's about the case where this old woman spilled McDonald's coffee in her lap, burnt herself terribly. And the propaganda when she sued McDonald's, there was this massive propaganda push. And people were talking about all the frivolous lawsuits bringing up, suing people because your coffee is too hot. It's ridiculous. What we need is massive reform of massive tort reform to stop people being able to bring lawsuits against companies so easily. And that's essentially what happened. It was a perfectly justifiable case, but she had terrible burns. But what happened is companies got legal protection out of it. So you can see how much, like a few lawsuits against police for doing their job hit the headlines. And we've seen that over the last few years. This guy sued the police because they broke his wristwatch restraining him or something. And then he gets $1 million out of it or something ridiculous like that. They will use that as justification. They will created it to use it as justification. They're going to say, well, our guys now, because of Black Lives Matter, because of Antifa or whatever, can't do their job properly without being sued, and it's not fair. That will be their argument. I would be shocked if that didn't happen.
Yeah, it's crazy to me that we get to a position where, I mean, look, it's obvious to anybody objective that there are examples like that where there is an unjustifiable attack on or going after them for something they didn't do intentionally or didn't even do. But it's incredible to me that we err on the side of more protection when the argument should be, well, we should be holding them to the highest standard, the higher standard, right? We should be making sure that they are held to that screw. Like that just makes more sense for somebody who is it's I guess in my mind, it's the same as like the U.S. government, the global foreign policy dynamic, where they go, well, Russia's using cluster bombs, so we're going to give our guys cluster bombs, or that's not even the way it actually went down. But the argument being, well, then you're just the same. You're just rationalizing, we're going to do the same thing back. It's the same kind of thing we're talking about, that they should be held to a much higher standard. And I'm with you. I think this is about creating a situation where there is no ability to go after the enforcer, you know, and it's an alarming step in the direction more so of an authoritarian control structure. Add to that the digital aspect, you know, which I think is where all this goes, and then it's insurmountable. But
just remember, though, you have cities all across America where essentially there is no or very little law enforcement, and you've gutted the police, and you've put in Soros prosecutors who won't prosecute crime. And you do have a serious crime problem because you've basically gutted your enforcement. And that is a problem in cities. And it's a big, big problem for the real estate community in those cities. And remember, you know, Trump is somebody who understands and sympathizes with real estate.
I think that's an important point people tend to overlook, is that he's very big business, right? He's very much, I mean, even in the context of like removing regulations, he always tries to frame it in a way that it's like pro-freedom. And there is a very clear argument to be made within that, but it's a dangerous level when you're emboldening the corporate side while moving regulations. If you're going to move regulations, then it should be not emboldening them at the same time. Like they should be like, that's the point about suing and so on.
So I want to bring up a question. I want to go back to Howard Lutkin talking about the fact that the U.S. has $500 trillion worth of real estate and minerals, We know under Trump in 2018, the United Geological Survey started to survey all the mineral resources in the country, starting at the ground level, going down 3,000 feet, including finding the rare earth minerals that would replace what has been coming from China. So there is an enormous effort to understand what the resources are within North America and see if you can't get more of what you need. We know that Trump has said he wants to drill oil aggressively. And many people don't realize around the world, the federal government and the states combined owe a huge portion of the land, particularly in certain states like Alaska. I think it's 70% of the land in Alaska.
Which is entirely unconstitutional, by the way.
Right. We know two things. On some of the Bitcoin trial balloons, they proposed that you could sell your Bitcoin secretly, and if you invested in real estate, you could do it tax-free. So basically proposing a 1031 swap so that, if I bought Bitcoin at a penny and I sell it, with a government buying program at a very high price, then I can keep it secret and I can convert, if I put it in the right kind of real estate, no taxes, so tax-free. The guy who just got appointed or nominated to the Secretary of HUD position is someone with a long, deep history in opportunity zones. Now, does everybody know what an opportunity zone is? It's a tax plan that was really created in response to the tech industry, who had huge capital gains on their stock. And basically, if you sell stock or sell any investment and roll it into real estate or a business in an opportunity zone, you can roll it in tax-free. And if you leave it in long enough, you're tax-free forever. So you've avoided all your capital gains taxes. So now we've got Howard Lutkin licking his chops over $500 trillion of real estate, RFK proposing that people be able to get out of Bitcoin at a high tax-free as long as they put their money in real estate. And now we got an opportunity zone guy over at HUD. I don't know if you remember this, but during the riots during COVID, we did an analysis of where all the riots were, and they were very much contiguous to where the New York or where the Fed offices were, but also very contiguous to opportunity zones. So if you look at where the riots were in Minneapolis, it was basically a way of clearing all the real estate and getting a hold of all the real estate at the base of a big opportunity zone in downtown Minneapolis. So, I go back to the plunder opportunity here. If you are going to, take the U.S. out of its lead position or even break it up, because we know there are people who would love to break it up. The big question is who gets all the assets and how are you going to reposition all the assets? Because the assets on the U.S. balance sheet are extraordinary.
Probably makes a more Freedom City dynamic. Just, half joking,
Right.
but that's where this seems to be going, right? This kind of sidestep. And again, same kind of point in general that I'm seeing everywhere under a guise of, some breaking away from the system dynamic when really it's just kind of beginning the new step. I mean, I'm seeing this technocracy rise all over the place. There's a lot of that happening right now with Trump's administration. I mean, one point that I wanted to talk about before I don't know how much time we had time in general today, but is about this overlapping dynamic of his ethics pledge, the transition pledge, have you guys been seeing that conversation? I mean, there's very much a policy dynamic there. And that does overlap with the foreign policy point. Well, first, since we are on the foreign policy overlap, since you mentioned China, it is one of the things he's discussing about taking a hardline stance on China. And I do think that has to do with the overlap of the rare earth mineral foreign policy issue, but for restrictions on Chinese owned infrastructure and so on, I think those are interesting points in there. But for me, the overlap of this, and again, this point has to do with anybody. It doesn't matter a foreign entity. Is this timing right now where Trump hasn't signed the ethics pledges? Or rather, it's an ethics and a transparency pledge, something he signed into law more so in 2020 that he did last time as well. But it leaves this opening gap where there's no cap on donations there, and you don't have to divulge from where those donations are coming from. You don't have to divulge your conflicts of interest. And so
that's the financing of the transition, correct?
But both, yes. So that opens up all the funding for the offices for all these different things. And so that's one of the most alarming points is they're pushing back on that in general, saying we don't need it. We're going to be a fully self-sufficient organization, and they're using their own bot. They're walking out of Mar-a-Lago. They're not using government emails and computers. And I mean, part of that to me is like, I get it, but I'm very concerned. So in conjunction with the idea that you're not divulging where your money's coming from, so you have no caps, trillions could be flowing in from Israel, China, we'd have no idea, no conflicts of interest divulged, and then they're working in their own areas, self-sufficient, not taking money from the government. And so my point is there's this gap right now where that's happening. They're already getting access to certain information. I find that to be really alarming. And I think that speaks to a foreign policy.
The one thing I will say is if I was running a presidential transition, I would do the same thing. So I can see why it feels and looks alarming. I think if they don't have ethical standards and full financial disclosure when they go in, that will be very alarming.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to bring up, I think the number one or one of the most important policy goals right now that's desired is the Federal Reserve has a big problem, and that problem is called the U.S. Constitution. And as long as the Constitution exists, they have, the Fed is a creature of Congress. Congress created them. Congress can cancel them. And they're not independent. And so if they're going to move forward with a control grid, they need to find a way to get rid of the Constitution or get free of or at least the Federal Reserve to get free of the Constitution. And how are they going to do that? And that's one of the things absolutely to watch in this administration. One way they can help get rid of the Constitution is to basically be able to control government payment systems and operations. And that's why if you're Doge and you get rid of the civil service and replace it with tech contractors, but bing, that's how you do it. You've now got control through basically the intelligence agencies and the central bank, and Congress no longer controls government operations.
I can't help but again the overlap of the technocratic side of that, right? Like all these different overlaps, and I mean, even going back to the same point, like the influence of another entity in all of this is something that stands out to me more than anything. I mean, there's obvious corruption taking place, but to me, I can't stop seeing how that intertwines, right? I mean, is that something? Is that more, Catherine, directly? Do you think that's something that is more of a oversized concern, or do you think that's a right on the surface?
No, and here's the thing: what happens over time is power accrues to the guy who sort of controls the infrastructure and handles things operationally. So the way the U.S. got the power to do the sanctions is literally we evolved the internet and the hardware that carried the internet to the point where 99% of digital communications and transactions went through the U.S. in a way that the U.S. could assert legal and financial and operational jurisdiction. And so if you end up with Amazon, Google, and Lockheed Martin running all of the payment systems and operations in the U.S. government, they end up having tremendous power. It comes over time through just their operational control. And that's why, we've seen really a dramatic reduction of operational control by Congress as more and more. I mean, the rise of the deep state is the rise of corporate contractors, defense contractors, big tech firms, and banks ending up controlling and running all of the government's operations, including their financial transactions.
Well, and this was a point I was trying to make when people were doing cartwheels over the nomination of Kash Patel. Kash Patel is one of those guys who believes that the deep state is just Democrats we don't like, right. As opposed to what Catherine just laid out in terms of the operational infrastructure of how the deep state moves.
Right, which is why we're... Oh, go ahead.
It was very strange. I was watching a recent interview that Kash Patel did, and he said, day one, I'm going to shut down the the FBI headquarters in Washington and turn it into a deep state museum and send the 7,000 agents out into the rural areas and countryside. And, it's like the Cultural Revolution. But here's the thing. If you understand how federal bureaucracy works, you know that you can't do that without congressional approval. You can't fund a travel budget that can do that. You can't move your staffing levels all over the country without, those staffing levels are controlled and dictated and influenced by the Appropriations Committee and OMB. I mean, you're just as the head of the FBI, you don't have the power to arbitrarily do that. Why would you say that? He should, if you look at his resume, he knows better.
I think it's the same point. I think it's the same point before. Go ahead, Ken.
a lot of what they're saying at the moment is just about pleasing the people at the back
Right.
with the big Trump signs. I mean,
Right.
like, we're going to audit the IRS is part of that as well. Like, everybody hates the IRS, so we'll say something about how we'll audit the IRS, and we'll get all the people that resent paying income tax every April to cheer.
Oh, I think because Palantir already has an IRS contract, as far as I know, I think they are going to do.
Well, I think they might
Yeah.
do it, but I think the only reason to say they're going to do it is to please. Like, they could just as easily have just put that in a 2-line press conference in January, in a 2-line press release in January, and not make a big public thing of it.
Right.
I think it's the secondary part as well, though. It's not just about, it's about pointing to that, but also seeing the being able to frame it as the Democrats wouldn't let him do the thing that would have saved everybody. Like, that's always how this seems to go, right? Like, Senate confirmation is the same point. So eventually you can, like, as long as they keep the zombie thing going forward and act like, well, we would have, I mean, I make this point about Obama and the rest, and Obama would have changed the world, but they wouldn't let him do it. Like, they constantly keep doing this. Trump's term was the same thing. They tricked him or they did this. So I think that's where this plays out, in the interest of shoving us into the next control structure.
So
Well, I
Ryan,
suppose.
you go, kid.
Well, I was going to say we've talked a lot about policy down the line, but there is the inauguration and the confirmation hearings. Like, who do you think of the nominees will get their job, and who do you think is going to be turned away?
Yeah, good question. Did you want to say something first, Catherine?
Oh, so I was just going to tell you a story. When I was assistant secretary at housing, I got a call from the head of public affairs who said, "You're in real trouble with the Heritage Foundation," which is a conservative think tank in Washington. I said, "Oh, well, that's terrible. Why don't we just invite them over to dinner?" So I invited a couple of people who ran the Heritage Foundation over to my house for dinner. We had a little dinner party. And I said, "Pray tell, what have I done to offend you?" And they said, "Well, the secretary went up to Harlem and had a press conference with Charlie Rangel, and he told him he was going to fund all these projects in Harlem. And then he came back and told you to do it, and then you're implementing it." And I said, "Well, yes, he ordered me to do it, and it's all perfectly legal. And so, I'm implementing his orders." And they said, "No, you don't understand. You're supposed to make sure it never happens." And he can say it's the bureaucracy because he ordered it, but you're supposed to just not do it. And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Because the point of the press conference is to make sure that the white women in Westchester who watch the press conference think that we care about people, but we don't want to waste any money. We already get the result from the press conference. But you're the guy who's got to stop it, so he has plausible deniability. You just didn't realize that."
So depressing. And what's most depressing, Catherine, is that we know that that's everywhere. That's policy as usual or business as usual.
Well, but here's the thing. I was at the dentist this morning, and the dentist said to me, he said, because I'm back in the Netherlands, he said, how was it being over in America during the period of the election? And I said, "Well, every 4 years we lose our minds. And then, hopefully within some reasonable period of time, we get it back." And they just thought that was very funny because to the world, it does look like we've lost our minds.
Yeah.
And I keep coming back to the question that the role we have as media, how do we help the people watching this to understand what Kid is describing or you're describing? This is theater, and you need to get back into the real world and stop wasting your time on the theater, let alone getting played for a patsy by the theater. How do we help everybody get back into the real world?
That is the question of the time, isn't it? I mean, the same thing we're talking about. How do you reach somebody in a cult, like somebody who's like socially engineered? Like, how do you circumvent that? How do you show them that they're wrong? These are classic questions in this field. And, there's a lot of, I think more than ever today, we're for some reason breaking through a lot of them. Honestly, I don't know. I think everyone has their own opinion. You guys want to chime in on that at all? Any thoughts? It's a complicated thing. It's more of those, we each have our own ways we try and circumvent it. It's a great question, though. And I think it's something we should be focusing on every day. How do we show them this? And not just, as I said recently, that we all can learn, myself especially, and not just, tell them they're wrong or stupid or do something that that's like, my point is you engage on Twitter all the time these days where you get pulled into these vitriolic conversations. And I think it's hard because, sometimes you think you are being like, they just don't want to, and you want to call them out for it. But sometimes it's about just trying to do what we're saying. Like, how do you reach them without making them feel stupid? Or, one of the things I'll point out since I'm asking the question is you try to find common ground. You come at it in a little bit of a, where, as if you make them feel that you're on the same side, that we see it the same way, but did you check out this thing that seems to contradict that? So it lets their guard down first before you address something that might influence their opinion, but it's a difficult thing. Plant the seed, water it as often as possible.
Well, the approach that you're describing is something that works incredibly well in like small group settings or one-on-one settings. But from, from behind a camera doing a show, what the best things that we can do is what we're already doing, which is highlighting all of the, blatant hypocrisy, the obvious agendas, to people, to people who may not necessarily see it, but from a number of different angles of approach. And so what my buddy Slim says from the Beef Initiative is that, the best thing that we can do is encourage absolutely everyone in our immediate spheres to change their consumption model. And that's across the board. That's what you're putting into your body. It's what you're putting into your brain. It's what you're doing to nurture your soul and your spirit. All of these things, if that's the example that's being set, and if that's the, kind of the conversations that we're having in our immediate, then it does have an expanded effect going out in that the consumption model in your community can get changed relatively quickly just via food. And if you want to turn anyone on the planet into a conspiracy theorist, give them a couple of chickens to raise. Chickens are the gateway drug to conspiracy theories. They are, because you notice immediately how much better the eggs are. And then you start thinking about that, and it opens up an entirely brand new world of thought that you wouldn't have ordinarily stumbled across had you just simply listened to any of us the first time.
Yeah, well said. I love it. I mean, I think the main point of what we're doing in general, and I recommend you guys check out his Texas Slim in general and the work he does. Steve talks to them often, just challenging these models more than, the consumption model, I think, is a good analogy. The term even works in itself, but more than just food, just kind of like what you consume media wise and everything else, and reflect on, how you may change that. And I think what's important is that the people watching, I'm of the mind, and I know I say this often, of a positive end. I think more people than not are beginning to see this, or at least be entertaining these questions. And I think it's because of the work that you're all doing here and the work that we're all doing with the IMA. I really do see that. And I think it's a positive note. But why don't we end with the conversation, the point that Kit put forward on who, like our prediction, essentially, on the different cabinet picks and the different people who will or will not, go into as much depth as you'd like. Whoever wants to start. You want to start, Steve?
I think that it'll be a difficult win for them to get absolutely everyone. I know that there are a number of different Democrats running around threatening to make sure that Tulsi Gabbard doesn't see the DNI's office. I know there are people that are big mad at Bobby, and he may not see HHS. Kash Patel's a toss-up because, again, and as with Gabbard, as with everyone who's been tapped, they are Israel first. They've made that perfectly clear. Tulsi Gabbard has a long-standing history of being very, very anti. I think the focus group tested phrase she uses is radical Islamist jihadists, radical Islamists. I think that's the Gabbard phrase for it. But she is very much in favor of, the Bush doctrine, as far as, preemptive strikes on countries that may harbor quote unquote terrorists. But a lot of people don't like her. I think you're going to see the more, quote unquote radical elements that he's tapped get pushed to the side in favor of more establishment creatures. However, if you put somebody in a position that's a politically appointed position in the first place, their power is greatly hindered by the bureaucracy that supports them. And so, it could have all of the effect of a ceremonial appointment.
Well, I think in general, my overview on this is that kind of in similar line with what Kit and mostly everyone else is putting forward today, is that I think that these picks are designed in a way to distract to say like this, to rather rationalize and justify a pick that they otherwise wouldn't have wanted if it wasn't first they floated Pompeo and Nikki Haley, right? Like that's already kind of happened. So these ones are a little bit less or more digestible. The when and how is hard to say. I think the ones that I would argue, my prediction more than anything, I don't think RFK Jr. is going to be allowed. I think that was the ploy. I think that he, regardless of his blind spot for Israel, it has a lot. I mean, right now is in contradiction to a lot of what the other parts of the administration are doing, right? Even the vaccine direction, the mRNA direction. I mean, if there's 14 different things you could point out that he seems to be against, that the rest of the administration is sort of at least allowing to go forward. So I think that he will be refused in Senate confirmation, and then they'll blame the Democrats, and that's why they won't have to go after mRNA, which both I think all of them, Thiel, Vivek, Musk, all of them are invested in one way or another in that direction, which scares me. But I think the other ones that are the other one, like a Musk, is an interesting overlap. I can't tell whether that was one that was meant to not be or not, in my opinion, but I think I'll just end on my prediction. I think there's some that are designed not to make it, RFK being the one I'll point to. But the interesting part is you have the rest of them, like the Hegseth, the Huckabees, the Bondis, that are aggressive Zionists that are probably going to fly through with no problem. And I think that's going to be a big red flag to show you that that's not the things they're worried about, despite how they're screaming about prophetic Zionist end time, like real conversations about how we're going to lead that. It's terrifying. But I think or like a Patel, same kind of thing, is that I think that's going to be the standout, is that gets flying by. And then whether Musk makes it or not, I think is an interesting example of, again, same point. If he makes it, I think it'll say a lot. Oh, go ahead, Catherine.
Musk does not need a confirmation. He's not in a cabinet position.
Oh, I'm glad you said that, actually.
He doesn't need a...
If they establish a Department of Government Efficiency, will he then require confirmation?
If they make it a cabinet department, yes, but I don't think they will make it a cabinet department. I think they'll make sure he doesn't need confirmation.
Yeah, you got Vivek Ramaswamy out here running around complaining about unelected bureaucrats while he's trying to become an unelected. Life should come with a rim shot now. Just every time these clowns open their mouth.
That's funny.
So, Ryan, I have to tell you, I do think that Bobby's going to get confirmed.
Yeah.
And
I hope so.
The reason I think he's going to get confirmed is if you look at what I think the deep state wants to, or the establishment wants to accomplish with this administration, they want to keep the young people, in the tent pissing out and not outside the tent pissing in.
Good point.
And I think they're looking to get RFK to do that. They also know that what has happened with food and drugs has gone way beyond anything. It really needs a course correction. So I think the establishment is willing to tolerate a course correction. They think one's needed, but I think they're going to use this to keep him, pulling the young people back in the tent in a way that, for many of us, it would probably be better in the long run if RFK wasn't confirmed. But I think the worst parts of the establishment want him confirmed. And that's what will get him confirmed, because obviously the Democrats are still stinging from what happened. Even though they were the ones who threw him out of the Democratic Party, he had no choice but to leave. They made him. But even though they see him as a turncoat, I think I basically think the central bankers and intelligence agencies will overrule them, and he will be confirmed. It's my theory.
Real quickly, in your mind, does that make him... Sorry, Kit, real quick, does that make him, in your mind, somebody who's aware of that, or that he's being used?
I think he's being used, and if I think he will try and get some very good things done in the food and health area. Mm-hmm. And if I were him, I would ignore why various people are supporting me, and I would just go and try and get them done. So, yeah, you always, whenever you're in one of these in a highly centralized system, you always have people using you that you would prefer not to have using you. It's the way it is.
Interesting. Go ahead, Kit.
I was going to agree. I was going to say that I think Kennedy, they can't afford not to approve Kennedy. He was so much of the ticket, and his name still brings, the family name still brings such a cachet with it that I think they have to let him in. And I think in some ways what he wants, whether he wants it sincerely or not, can be parlayed into important stuff. I mean, they want to do food reform, and he's all over food reform. He wants to make food healthier. Like, the greater establishment plan is to make food like lab-grown blocks that you have to scan your wrist to get access to from your local food vending. machine. But there are similar things at play here. We want to limit the amount of calories people eat. We want to limit the kinds of food people eat. I think Gabbard won't make it. I think she's just there to be there. She'll be replaced with some other insider that no one's ever heard of. But I think Kennedy will make it. And I actually think my big wildcard prediction is that they will let him take fluoride out of the water. This will be the big winning cause for the first 6 months of the year. And they'll do it they won't actually do it. They'll do it in the government way. They'll have a year-long Senate hearing about the dangers of fluoridation. At which
it's
point
not federally mandated, though. I'm sorry, I got to jump in here real quick because Derek's not here to field this, but fluoride is already being removed from dozens and dozens of towns and municipalities. The Surgeon General of Florida issued guidance for the entire state to remove it about 10 or 11 days ago. This is something that is becoming more and more prevalent thanks to Fluoride Action Network. And really,
right, but that's the fact.
My point, really.
Right.
It's just look what we did.
I mean, the mythos may be that Kennedy will get credit for it, but I have to point out that it's already happening.
Well, Hochul, by the way, is carrying out new programs to add more fluoride. So there's going to be an opening there for something. Yeah. So I agree with
the big opening is going to be whatever genius out there is already making fluoride pills and fluoride drops to sell to all the outraged soccer moms on both coasts who desperately want to put fluoride back in their own water.
I have a fluoride removal system because my girl lives in Marin County, which is one of the most heavily fluoridated counties in the entire state of California. And I got it direct, it's a fantastic system. But it's only good for the sink. You can't do a thing about it through the shower. You would have to hook up a secondary one for your bathroom if you wanted one for your bathroom sink for every bathroom. And it's, but that's what it takes if you want, if you're unfortunate enough to live in a county or municipality where they still do that, particularly at the rate that they do in Marin.
But excellent points made in general. Did you have something more to add, Kit? Or was that I didn't want to cut you off.
No, that was pretty much it.
I think it's a good point, is that it's all about I guess it seems like we all generally agree that it's about presenting the illusion, or rather just the narrative, the construct to, whether maybe some positives come out of it or not, it's about more so presenting it a certain way. So what I think is really interesting is what we kind of highlighted there is that I guess it comes down to whether we think they want it to appear as if they won or not in a long-term sense, right? So if they want the people to think that Trump and his team are succeeding in their mission, then I think, it makes sense to have RFK be a part of that. But if they want them to feel that they are still under the attack of the Democrats, that's where my mind kind of goes, where it's about constructing this illusion that they're still under the fight, which will drive more support into the final stage, right? But I guess that's the end point. And either way, it still seems to be going in the same direction. I do see a positive of RFK in there for some of the policies, like Catherine's saying, that I think are obviously good in a lot of ways, but I have that concern. I guess we'll just have to wait and see how this plays out. I think there's a lot of good things that were discussed today. I think it's going to come down to January 20th forward and what actually rolls out, who's actually tapped, whether the confirmations are actually there. We have a while till we see what's really going on. So
we haven't even touched on the idea they pull some Democrat version of January 6th yet, or something like that. Right. I mean, there's a lot of big things that could happen in that time.
Yeah, good point. That's actually a really good point, that we don't know what will happen between then. There's this weird limbo period that always happens where if it's good right now, Trump somehow tries to grab it, make it his, even though he's not in power. If it's bad, it's, it's like this weird time frame where if it's bad, it's still Biden, even though usually they claim that he's not in power at all. It's like this, everyone points at everybody else.
I kind of feel like the Democrat version of January 6th would be a bunch of liberals showing up and then trying to get the Capitol Police to go in and drag Trump out. I don't feel like that. I don't even feel like they would take a podium or anything.
Well, but I get the joke is well taken, but I think what's interesting though is that it would ultimately amount to the same thing it was last time, which I argue were not a bunch of Republicans going crazy, right? I think
I was there. I know what I saw.
Yeah,
and it definitely wasn't that. It definitely wasn't. The
so
whole
again,
thing's ridiculous.
Well, it could be the same idea, right? Where you just have a bunch of masked people that are FBI agents for all we know, and it just becomes some, the point is it's all up in the air. And that's a great point to consider, that we don't know how it would play. Alex Jones is floating that the deep state Democrats are planning some kind of a we're going to stop him from taking power, which, by the way, wouldn't be that surprising. But I don't know. Again, it comes down to whether it wants to appear as if he has succeeded in all of this, and now they're going to just blindly accept whatever goes forward, or whether they want more push to drive it forward. It's up in the air. Or maybe we're all wrong, and we've already been saved, and we're all happy now. So who actually knows? But that's a good place to pin it in general. I really appreciate these kind of conversations. Go ahead, Kit.
We're all going to look really ridiculous when it's 2035 and we're all living in Musk's space cities and everything's fine.
I really hope that's not the case. It's a terrifying future. But I think we should eventually have more of a direct panel on the idea of the technocratic overlap, the kind of Freedom City, Prospera, technocrat kind of overlap of all of this, which I don't know about you guys, but I really see the fingerprints that kind of it's poking out all over the place, where it's kind of like a sidestep of power into some kind of a technocrat driven mindset. I think that's where this all goes, but that's for another conversation, I think. But anything else you guys want to leave us with on the way out? Anybody else? Final thoughts?
No, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation, guys. Thank you. And there's plenty more.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, Kit, Steve, and Vork, and Derek, and everybody else that will be coming to the upcoming panels and so on. I do have one notification on the way out that I think the last insight we got from Odyssey was the next update will be coming probably the beginning of January, a little bit further out than I wanted, but still coming up soon. So that looks like after Christmas we'll be getting hopefully the new IMA website, which will be more of this will be funding through there. So, but lots more panels and interesting conversations coming your way. So we'll leave it there. Thank you all for joining today. And
everybody have a Merry Christmas.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yes.
Before then, have a Merry Christmas. And leaving out with my tagline, as always, everybody question everything, come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.